because that was a massive leap of faith for you to say, I'm going to take God at his word because I believe with confidence this is what God has called me to do.
Interestingly, I think the excuses in a nutshell, and then we can talk about it, my initial thoughts were, I can't, not sure you will, there's surely somebody better than me to do this.
Welcome to Let's Talk About That, the podcast where we take a deeper dive into Sunday's message and explore any questions you might have. I'm your host, AJ Stevens, joined by lead pastor Chip Parker, and I'm thrilled to be on this journey with you. Whether you're a longtime member of the Orchard or a first-time visitor, Let's Talk About That is your space to explore, reflect, and connect. Join us as we navigate the intricacies of faith, spirituality, and daily life, seeking to understand how the wisdom shared on Sundays can be applied to our modern challenges. So, grab a cup of coffee, find a comfortable space, and let's dive in together. This is Let's Talk About That, where the conversation about Sunday's message never stops.
Welcome in, everybody. Obviously, I'm not AJ. I'm Chip. AJ is out this week, but I do have with me today a special guest that you are familiar with. We have Pastor Eddie here with us today, filling in, and I appreciate you stopping in to talk about that with us this morning.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Chip. I'm a little nervous. You know, these podcasts make me a little nervous, but yeah, I'm sure you'll lead me through it, so we're good.
Well, you know, you should be a little intimidated because, truthfully, we have dozens of listeners worldwide.
That's what I've heard. I'm hoping to double those today.
That would be fantastic. Speaking of our dozens of listeners out there, if you haven't already, do us a favor. Go ahead and subscribe or follow to the podcast. Leave a review on whatever platform you're listening on. It is a big help to us to helping it get out there to other people, and feel free to share it on your social media pages and also by word of mouth. We really do this because we do think the content's helpful. I mean, honestly, we have fun doing this, but we do think the content is helpful, and especially if you missed our last episode, it dropped on Friday of last week, if you're listening to this on the Tuesday that it drops, and it was a roundtable conversation between all four of our pastors talking about really how do you know and discern God's voice in your life. I think it was an incredible conversation. It brings a lot to the sermon series that we have been going through, and it's something I think will be well worth your time to listen to if you missed it. So like, share, subscribe, leave a rating. It helps us out tremendously, and I promise you that we will continue to we'll not try to mess this up too bad.
Yeah, I totally agree with last week, Chip, and I was going to plug that if you didn't. Beth and I listened to it I guess the same day it dropped. You know, I got to tell you, I was impressed with our young guys. Our young pastors are sharp guys. They had some excellent content that they contributed to that conversation. And I've said before how sharp they are, but I think there's a chance for you to really go on and listen to these guys. They give a lot of thought, a lot of study. They're their background is strong, and yeah, I would listen to that.
Yeah, I think it's good. I teased it. I preached in Lake City yesterday on Sunday, and I teased the podcast by saying that in that podcast, if you haven't listened to it yet, there is a fantastic story about Matt making me laugh in a funeral. And at one point in the podcast, I look at the three of you and say, I don't mind y'all being wrong. So,
yeah, I remember that very well.
Hopefully that'll whet your appetite a little bit. But today is not a special episode. We're actually winding down our series we've been going through for the last few weeks, called Excuses. We've had a progression in the same story that has kind of unpacked a chapter at a time through this series. It started with Sarah when God came to Abraham and Sarah, said, you're going to have a son. Sarah said, one problem, I'm 90. And for me, that doesn't sound much like an excuse. That sounds like a reason. But, you know, God says even your best reason doesn't hold up when I've said this is going to happen. I've said it. It happens. Sarah has a son. We saw Moses be called by God to go and lead that nation that came through that son out of slavery while they were in Egypt. And so Moses says, I can't do that. I'm not smart enough. I'm not eloquent enough. I'm not persuasive enough. God says, I'll be with you. That's enough. I don't call the equipped. I equip the called. And so Moses goes, leads them out. And now we follow the people that Moses leads out that come from Sarah's son to the edge of the promised land. And God says that they're going to go in and take possession, and it's going to be their land. And yet we find one more time in the third week of this series, they make excuses. We can't do it. Land's too big. People are too big. Cities are too strong. And that's what we talked about Sunday. So what Pastor Eddie, kind of stuck out to you in this week's message as that story unfolded?
Well, if I could just go back even further, I think in all three of these, the thing that stands out to me is these are not just arbitrary excuses. These are excuses that we still use today. You know, I mean, it's not 100%. Like we're just looking back as a bunch of guys in history who made some mistakes or made some excuses. These are excuses that as we're going through them, I find myself using them all the time. So I think that stuck out to me in a real way.
Hold on. You and Miss Beth aren't expecting, are you?
I know, pretty sure.
I was just wondering. You got really specific there for a minute. It just threw me. No, I know exactly what you mean. You know, it is easy. I confess this Sunday. Sometimes it's easy to be shocked when God actually does what he says it's going to do. Yeah. And I know that is something that I maybe shouldn't admit publicly, but I've told you, there's been a couple times I've been like, man, God did exactly what he said he was going to do in his word. I don't know why it surprised me, but I think it's because we make these excuses in our head about why it won't happen.
Yeah, and I think, too, as we said in the first one, and here's how, to me, the story of Sarah related to me so well, is that I think that we made the comment that sometimes it's not that we don't believe God can, it's that we don't believe God will.
Yeah.
And we're not sure, not can he do this, but will he do this? And I think I've used that excuse many, many times. You know, I don't think God will do that.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. One of the things that I think really stuck out to me this week, and I brought it out in both services in Lake City, is that really this week didn't have a happy ending. It was a tragedy. You know, when Sarah laughed, God said, well, you're still going to have a son. I'm going to come back in a year. When Moses made an excuse, God said, well, I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to equip you. I'm going to give you a staff. I'm going to give you signs. I'm going to give you your brother Aaron, and I'm going to be with you. But with this excuse, when the spies came back and said, we can't take the land, and the people said, we're not going to take the land, there wasn't a second chance this time. I think that was a little bit different. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that is a sad ending, you know, and it was a sad ending for those people. You'd like to spin it and say, oh, yeah, but they did eventually get to go into the land. But the truth is that generation didn't get to go into the land, not even Moses. And it did kind of end on a sad ending. And I think the one thing that turns it is, I recall in the New Testament where the Apostle Paul's writing to the church at Corinth, and he says, these things, speaking about the Old Testament story, the Old Testament history, these things happen to us for examples. And I think the good news is, all right, let's learn from that. You know, it's a failure, and it was a costly failure for those people. So let's us learn from that, and let's us understand and recognize our excuses and trust God rather than to focus on the obstacles in life.
Yeah, and I think that you are spot on with that. I think that the idea that we get to learn from their excuses is something I don't think that should be lost on us. I'll never forget, my grandpa told me when I was growing up that there are three kinds of people. There are those who won't learn from their excuses, those who will learn from their excuses, and those who learn from the excuses of others.
Yeah.
And he highly encouraged, be that third group of person. Be the person who can learn from other people's excuses, not just in, you know, everyday relationships, but here in the pages of Scripture. Let's learn from their mistakes and not have to make them on our own. You know, one thing that my mind went to after this week's message, and you just brought it to mind with that idea that we should learn this lesson, is that the author of Hebrews says the same thing. Mm-hmm. So in Hebrews chapter 4, in verse 1, the author of Hebrews says, therefore, since the promise to enter his rest remains, that's the rest of God, let us beware that none of you be found to have fallen short, for we've also received the good news just as they did, talking about the nation of Israel who wouldn't enter the promised land. But the message they heard did not benefit them, since they were not united with those who heard it in faith. For we who have believed have entered the rest in keeping with what he has said. So I swore in my anger, they will not enter my rest, right? Like those people, they didn't believe by faith that God was going to keep his words. They stayed out of the promised land. And so what they're saying, what the author of Hebrews is saying for us now, in verse 6, if you skip down, he says, therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and for those who formerly received the good news did not enter it because of disobedience, he again specifies a certain day today. He specified this speaking through David after such a long time. Today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts. For as Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. Therefore, a Sabbath rest remains for God's people. For the person who has entered his rest had rested for his own works, just as God did from his. Let us then make every effort to enter the rest, so that no one will fall into the same pattern of disobedience. And so it's striking to me that the author of Hebrews sees the nation of Israel's disobedience from entering the promised land as the same as our disobedience from resting in Jesus and resting from our own self-righteousness. And for me, man, I think that should be a warning, a wake-up call, something to consider for people who have just been in church a long time and feel like this is, they've got this down, but really when they step back, there's no real change or growth in their life. Maybe we need to make sure that we're not like the children of Israel, sitting outside the promised land and not willing to trust God by faith to go in.
Yeah, I think you're right. Boy, there's so much that goes with this story, and there's so much conviction. I think as a leader, one of the things that's always troubled me with this story, and maybe you got a good answer, that still troubles me a bit, is the fact that those people did not get to go into the land, but neither did Moses.
Yeah.
And I mean, how do you leave Moses out? With all the right things that Moses did. Now, Pastor Matt made a great observation as we were talking about this last Tuesday. And the observation was that not only did this decision affect the men who made it, but it affected other people as well. And I think that the caution is that sometimes our excuses not only impact us, it impacts people around us or people who might miss out because of us or whatever. And so I look at Moses not getting to go into that land, and I wonder about that. Boy, that's convicting.
Well, I think, man, I had not thought about that, Eddie, but what a good word and maybe way to round out the series in many respects, because we've talked about this series is all about trusting God. Mm-hmm. And just because he hasn't before doesn't mean he won't this time. And really being sensitive to follow what God has said. So why didn't Moses enter the promised land? Numbers 20, right? And I know you know this, Eddie. Let me read this for everybody listening. Numbers 20, verse 1 says, the entire Israelite community entered the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and they settled in Kadesh. Miriam died and was buried there. And there was no water for the community, so they assembled against Moses and Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, if we had only perished when our brothers perished before the Lord, why have you brought back the Lord's assembly to this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you led us up from Egypt to bring us out of this evil place? It's not a place of grain, figs, vines, and pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. So, pause. If you look at this and you remember what passage we read Sunday, it was from Numbers 13. This is after the disobedience going into the land. This is when God says, okay, now you're not going to go into the land. And they are now going back to the desert to walk around in circles for 40 years while God teaches them a lesson about trusting him. That's why I read an author this morning. I was reading a completely different book, but he referenced this. And the author said, if God thought this lesson was worth 40 years, maybe we ought to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
40 years, trust me, right? So they're in the wilderness, and the first thing the people of Israel say is, why did you bring us out here?
Yeah.
Well, no, you chose to come out here. You didn't trust God.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No,
I was just going to say, when you talk about that, it just reminds me. So I was preaching in Live Oak yesterday, and I told them, I nerded out a little bit. Saturday night. Yeah, you'd have been proud of me. I nerded out because I was tweaking my keynote, my slides for the message, and I looked at some maps because, we talked about trying to backtrack where we had been with Moses and how he had made the Exodus, how he got from Egypt to where he was, and then down to Mount Sinai, and then up to place that they were at that our text. And I was nerding out thinking I could draw this map and I could draw how they got to Mount Sinai. And then I could talk about how they got to where they are now. And I'm going through all of those things. And I'm reminded, as I looked at different maps, that nobody really knows where they went after this event.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we know they went south.
To be clear, what we're saying, though, is nobody's really sure. And even though the maps are in your Bible, they're not a part of Scripture.
Yes. Good point. Yeah, neither is the concordance. And all
That's right.
Yeah. But I was thinking about that and thinking about how they could very well have just, one of the maps suggests they just make loops.
Yeah.
Which reminded me of a mutual friend that we have from Perry, who always used to say, as he would go through the books of the Torah, he would say, always talk about Israel making a dumb move, not believing God, and God would say to them, take another lap.
Take another lap. Yeah, I feel that. As a baseball coach for small children, I get that. All right, boys, take another lap.
Yeah.
So Moses, not entering the promised land, Numbers 20, go to verse 6. They're out there. They got no water, got no food, right? It says, then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting. That's where God dwelt among them, right? They fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, take the staff and assemble the community. You and your brother Aaron are to speak to the rock. This is key. Speak to the rock while they watch, and it will yield its water. You will bring out water for them from the rock and provide drink for the community and their livestock. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he had commanded him. Moses and Aaron summoned the assembly in the front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels. His blood pressure's up. Yeah, right? Listen, you rebels. Must we, that's a key phrase to me, must we, Aaron and I, bring water out of this rock for you? And then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with the staff so that abundant water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. All right, so if you're reading and paying attention, and I tried to read it for you in a way that, you could hear it, Moses disobeyed God. Moses struck the rock. God said, speak to it. And why did Moses strike the rock? Well, we know that he struck the rock because this is the second time God brings water from a rock for the people. The first time was before their disobedience while they were making their way to the promised land. And God indeed did tell Moses, take your staff, strike the rock, and water came out. Except this time, Moses wasn't paying attention. Maybe he thought God got it wrong. Maybe he thought, well, God gave me this power, so me, Aaron, and I, we're going to bring water out of the rock, and I'm going to strike it. But whatever Moses was thinking, in verse 12, it says, but the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me. There's that lesson again. Because you did not trust me to demonstrate my holiness in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this assembly into the land I've given them. Man.
Yeah, that's why this is so convicting to me. Because, if we're just going to be honest, I mean, after all, it's just me and you sitting in this room. If we're just going to be honest, there's been times I've wanted to declare you bunch of rebels, you brutal vipers, as Jesus, to quote Jesus. And there's been times when I have not quite said it word for word, but pretty close, and say, must I do everything, Yeah. So it's convicting to me and a reminder to me as a leader. And I could be to any pastors out there listening. It could be to any group leaders out there listening. Anyone who's at a place of leadership. I think it's important that we remind ourselves often, as we said yesterday, it's not up to our ability and it's not what we do. It is a matter of trusting God. And I think so many times, there's been times when I've been under conviction that maybe I didn't listen to God. Maybe I didn't trust God enough, and it impacts everyone. So this is an extremely convicting series for me, and I hope for everybody else, because I don't think I'm alone in all these thoughts.
Yeah, I think that the series has really hit a lot of us, because at the end of the day, we make excuses because of that last lack of trust.
Yeah.
And the essential element of following Jesus is that trust, that we're going to trust him.
Yeah.
And so what I would like to do for the remainder of our time, which, hey, if you've got this pulled up in your vehicle or on your phone, you know how much time we have left. Eddie and I don't. But for the remainder of our time, I would like to kind of end this series, that idea of trust and excuses, faith and doubt. I would like to end that in a very practical, pointed way by maybe having you share with us what this looked like in your life when you were planting the orchard. Because God called you to plant the orchard when you were right about 50 years old, and you had every opportunity to make every excuse in the book about why you couldn't, why you shouldn't, or why he wouldn't. And so I'm interested, because I think you've kind of teased this a little bit as we've talked throughout the series and our meetings and together, that maybe, it has reminded you of some of that, because that was a massive leap of faith for you to say, I'm going to take God at his word because I believe with confidence this is what God has called me to do. So would you kind of set that stage for us, and let's lean into that story a little bit?
Yeah, I will. interestingly, I think the excuses in a nutshell, and then we can talk about it. I think my initial thoughts were, I can't, not sure you will. There's surely somebody better than me to do this. I'm too old.
All right. So let's hit pause, because I know the context and the reason that you're saying all that, but somebody listening to this for the first time may not know that context. Yeah. So you were, at this time in your ministry, you were how old?
I was 50.
You were 50. You were pastoring First Baptist Church, Perry, Florida.
Correct.
Not a mega church by any sense, but a very well-established, respected church. You know, one may say it was a platform with prestige, right? And you had been pastoring for how long by then?
I had been pastoring at that point for probably about close to 30 years.
Wow. Yeah.
About 30 years.
Not your first lap around the block.
No. And I was very comfortable.
Yeah.
After 30 years, you kind of learn how to do the job that was mine to do. I kind of knew how to be a traditional pastor. I was fairly comfortable in that role.
Because the churches you pastored were all traditional churches.
Oh, yeah. All of them were over 100 years old. All of them were well established. I knew how to do what we felt like we needed.
Well, and you had been at the churches that you pastored before coming to Perry, a considerable amount of time at both pastorates.
Yeah, 12 years at my first and 15 years at my second. And I assumed 12, 15 years again in Perry. And in all honesty, Beth and I just figured we would retire right there.
Yeah.
That would be our last church, and then we would retire. You know, it was not an exodus from Egypt, but it was a big deal for us.
It was a big step out.
Big step.
So when did you first get the inkling that this might be something God was calling you to do?
Honestly, now, as I've thought back on it, you know, and sometimes hindsight is way better than foresight. As I look back on it, I think the inkling started even when I was in Branford at First Baptist Church there.
Okay.
I think just a realization that time was changing and we weren't, you know, kind of like, okay, we're going to have to change a little bit our culture.
And when you say we, you're not just saying specifically First Baptist Branford.
No.
You're saying the church.
I'm saying the church, yes. And I felt like then we got to figure out something different. And so God began to birth in me and some ideas. And in fact, frankly, that's part of what he used to move me to Perry, was because some people there had caught a similar vision. Mm-hmm. And so I felt like, okay, this is what God's doing. And it was what God's doing. And by the way, I'll just say, man, they only spent 5 years in Perry. They were extremely foundational and helpful to my years in the orchard. I can see God's wisdom and sovereignty in that move because it just really prepared me.
Yeah. So a lot of people who may be listening to this, not everybody, but a lot of people may know that First Baptist Perry is actually where you and I met.
Right.
You know, I was dating Leanne Lynn at the time, and we got engaged and we're set to be married.
Yep.
And then you did your best to tell Leanne it was a mistake.
I tried hard, but she wouldn't listen.
Well, I was good looking. Emphasis on was.
Well, that's not what I laid it to.
Oh, okay. And so that's really where you and I met, you know, really doing some of that premarital counseling and everything. Right. But what a lot of people, maybe nobody really knows, is that things could have worked out for you and I a whole lot differently if a couple things had happened, because also during that time, I was graduating from Bible college. I was looking for my first job in ministry, and you and I began conversations because you had a staff opening at First Baptist Perry.
That's right.
And during that time, now looking back, you can say, hey, hindsight 2020, you had a very clear vision for what you wanted the church to look like and the staff to look like and the, you know, structure, systems, what have you, to look like. And I got to see those as we were talking about a staff position.
Right.
And lo and behold, not exactly the same, but a lot of that is what became the orchard down the road.
Yes, that's why I say the years in Perry were so foundational for me as far as the orchard goes, because God began to plant some thoughts, some burdens, I would say, some vision, and really saw in people and learned from people there how to make those things become real. And those were important days. And so it was a big deal for us to leave Perry. You know, it was not, you know, typically in our denomination, as you know, sometimes we get mad or somebody gets mad or a pastor leaves. If the pastor leaves, it's always for some reason.
Yeah.
You know, somebody pushed him out or he got mad and left, whatever. For us, that was not the case. In all honesty, we loved it in Perry. I love the church, still love the church today. They supported us, by the way.
Yeah, I want to get there because I do think that is a big part of the story of the step of faith and how God's people can help with that. I'm curious. I don't know that I know the answer to this, which I guess I should say, long story short, Eddie decided that he needed somebody a lot more gifted and talented than I did, so he didn't hire me at First Baptist. That's not exactly
sure
that's not
true.
exactly how it worked out.
That's not how I recall it.
The point is that you're at First Baptist, and at some point, you had to have that first thought of, am I about to plant a church?
Yeah.
So what was, when that thought first really started to get some substance? I don't know that I know the answer to this. What went through your mind the first time, like, church plant ran through your mind?
So you're going to think that this is a setup. The people listening are going to think that you teed something up for me here. But this is completely sincere. My first thought was, I can't.
Yeah.
I mean, in all seriousness.
So why? Let's talk about excuses. Why not? What did you think what made you think you, who had been pastoring successfully, this is not because Eddie's in the room, humble guy, but well-known, well-respected, sought-after pastor in North Florida. Why did you think you couldn't plant a church?
Okay, so several things come to mind. One thing was I didn't know how to do it. I've been in traditional churches, all of them over 100 years old. So I knew how to navigate things like, well, we've never done things this way, so how are we going to do them? I knew how to navigate slowly making transitions and changes. I knew how to do that. I didn't know how to start from scratch. I didn't know what all that entailed. And my first thought is, I just can't do this. And in all honesty, again, to quote yesterday's message, I didn't feel qualified. I felt very qualified. If another established church had been calling me and God had been saying, okay, it's time to move to another established church, I would have been okay with that. Yeah, I can do that. So I really didn't know how. The second thing closely akin to that is, in all honesty, I wasn't crazy about church plants at that time.
Yeah. Now, I have heard you talk about that. Yeah. In many ways, in traditional church world, sometimes church plants were the they that we talked about this past week. An obstacle, not a good thing, maybe.
Absolutely. In fact, and our dozens who listen here in North Central Florida understand what I'm about to say. In reality, there's a church every few miles apart. I mean, you don't have to travel more than 5 miles anywhere around here to be at a church. And my thought was, what we need to do is we need to maybe rekindle the flame in some churches that exist. Maybe that's what we need to do. We need to take care of each other, help each other, etc. But plant new churches. Why do we need new churches? That was my thought. And so that whole mindset had to change. So at the time, I'm thinking, why are we doing this? But what got the whole thing started is that I was approached by some people who, actually, it was our state convention that approached me about First Baptist, the church I was pastoring, to help start a new church at the beach. Yeah. Right? And so I said, well, yeah, we can do that, because I believed in missions. Yeah. And our church believed in missions. Yeah. And if it meant going to Keaton Beach, and I mean, that's far enough away from Perry that, okay, I can see that.
Which, if you're not from the Taylor County area, the word beaches there, when we call them the beaches, we mean that loosely. But there are a lot of people that live down there, and it is on the Gulf.
Yeah, I don't want to say anything. But I will just say this. My wife, the first time I took her to Keaton Beach, her response was, where's the beach?
Yeah, true story.
But anyway, that's really the first inkling. And then I started trying to talk myself out of it, right? Yeah. I'm not qualified. I don't think I'm the one to do this. I think what I need to do is I need to help them by offering financial support to Keaton Beach.
I need to be the help to be the planter.
Yes, I'll be glad to raise some money for them.
So let's tackle this in two parts, because I know one part of the answer. I don't know the second. So let's tackle this first. I know there's a very specific story about an orchard that began to change your mind about the need for church planting.
Absolutely.
Could you share that?
Absolutely, and I'm going to call his name. He won't mind, probably won't ever hear it anyway. David Adams came to me, a very trusted friend, and man, just a very special friend to me there in Perry. He took me, he worked for a forestry division out there, and he called me one day. He said, hey, I want to take you to see our orchard, our pine orchard. Well, first of all, I didn't know there was a pine orchard. I didn't understand that pine trees were actually in an orchard. And so he took me out. He showed me different stages of pine trees that were growing. I thought he was taking me to see the seedlings, that they had planted.
Yeah.
And he did eventually. He did get there. But he started when we first came in the gate. There were these huge, majestic pines, these that are so thick you can't put your arms around them, huge pines. And then you move a little further, and there's some a little bit younger than those, and a little bit younger than those, a little bit younger than those, until we get to the seedlings. And he said, see those old trees out there? He said, we leave those because even though they're beyond seed-producing years, they're beyond straw-producing, they're not really for much good other than timber. He says we leave them because they can protect the younger ones, and they serve some good, so we just leave them. And then you have these that are in their straw-bearing years and where they're producing fruit. You have some reproducing years where they're producing cones and seeds. And then you have the seedlings. And it struck me, I came to understand finally, because here's what he said. He said about the seedlings. He said, see those big trees? He said, we know that they're going to die or get taken away with a storm. Something's going to happen to them. We can't wait until they're gone to plant the seedlings. The seedlings need time to catch up. And it occurred to me that there's nothing wrong with existing churches. The existing churches serve their purposes, even if they're not reproducing, even if they're
on the backside of their life.
Yeah, even if they're not producing fruit, there's still some good they can do. But we can't wait for those to die without planting. That totally turned my attitude around, my mindset around.
Because if you're listening to this and you're half paying attention and haven't quite connected those dots, what you're saying is if we wait to plant new churches until we think we need them, it's too late.
It's too late. And you know what? We've been at this long enough now. That was some 18, 20 years ago. And now I've seen the reality of that happen.
Yeah,
because we're seeing some of those old trees, that is, old churches, are dying.
As many churches as are being planted in the United States of America, we are losing churches, not gaining them.
Yes.
Because we are losing them. They are shutting down at a faster rate than we're planting them.
Yes.
So that changed your mind about church planting.
Yes.
This is the part I don't know. What changed your mind about being a church planter that, okay, this is what God is calling me to do?
Yeah. Well, I did offer plenty of excuses along the way, and I think I had to one by one go by and deal with those excuses.
So if you could and if you're willing, maybe kind of rapid fire a couple of those for us.
Okay. Well, one of those excuses, maybe just as practical, and I can do it quickly. One of the excuses I had was, I'm 50 years old. How am I going to support myself? Because typically, this is not always the case, and it turned out not to be the case, but typically a church planter is going to have a job, right? Most church planters cannot live off the support of the church in its early days.
Yeah, it is very rare for that to be the case. And, I don't think you mind me saying, you and Miss Beth were very comfortable in the last few churches because of the growth of the church, the size of the church. Like you were, I don't know that there are many pastors who get rich in ministry, but it was a place where you're out of, hey, we're newly married, we're barely making ends meet. Hey, we've got money to put into retirement now.
Yeah, and they took very good care of us. Mm-hmm. And my thinking was, I'm 50 years old. The only degrees I have are theological or biblical degrees. I have my degree is in biblical study, both by undergrad and graduate work. So at 50 years old with nothing but Bible degrees, what kind of job am I going to be able to get?
Chick-fil-A?
Yeah, maybe. Seriously, that was a big obstacle. In fact, I recall at one point in time, Beth and I sitting, I can still see it. We were sitting in the living room by a fireplace, and we looked at each other. We had talked about this thing and talked about this thing and talked about this thing. And finally, I looked at her and smiled, and I said, now we both know there's really only one obstacle to get over, and that is money. I mean, that's just honest, Chip. I know that's not very spiritual. That's just honest.
I'm with you because in my mind, this is one of those places where excuses and reason becomes a very blurry line.
Yeah.
Because that wasn't an excuse. That was a reason.
Yeah.
Like you as a husband, you need to be able to take care of your family. You need to make sure that, stepping out on faith is not just an effort in futility, as in, we have a faith, but we have a reasonable and grounded faith. You know? And like you said, I think this, what you have to be certain of, okay, did God call me to this? If he did, I'm going to trust him, but I also am not going to try to figure out the means by which he's going to take care of us. The means by which he's going to take care of us may very well be, I've got to get a job outside of church.
Absolutely.
And I know you and I had conversations at this time. You did just that. You prepared for that.
I did. And don't get me wrong now. I'm not trying to keep up with the national personalities, TV personalities that make their millions. I'm not talking about that when I talk about money. I'm talking about putting bread on the table.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And so, I think that was critically important. So what I did, I thought about teaching, and I thought, well, that's something I love to teach. I think I'm a little bit gifted in that area. And so I thought maybe I could teach, and that would also keep me free on Sundays. And so I actually did go, and a good friend of mine, was in the education system, and he told me about the process of getting certified to teach. And so I boned up on my history a little bit and went to take the test at FSU to get certified to teach social sciences. And I passed the test.
Yeah,
I got certified.
I think that's phenomenal because to me, that is such a practical, real world example about how you did not let your excuse or really reason stop you from pursuing what God was calling you to, but yet you didn't go out and just run rogue in this. It was not, I'm trying to think of the right way to say this, but if you're listening to the podcast, maybe you know me a little bit by now and know that I struggle with nuance sometimes. So it was not a blind faith. It was God has given me the means and ability to work to earn an income. And so that may well be the means and ability that he's going to use to bring that to pass. It's not, if I just sit at home and wait for checks to come in the mail, that is not necessarily trusting God, as because you pursuing this job in church planting was the call. How you earned an income was not necessarily a part of what God had said or not said. Is that a good way to say that?
That's a good way to say it. And I think, again, reference last week, we talked about this some last week, how you can be sure that it's God. I think and we talked some about the need to be prayerful and discerning about that and to move carefully. I think there's nothing, I do not believe that it's a lack of faith to say, okay, while I'm waiting to hear God, I need to be moving the process along. So I didn't feel like that my going to get certified and finding a job was a negative, or I felt like it's still a step of faith because I got to find somebody to have me at 50 years old to teach, And so I feel like, I think that's an important word because sometimes I think we just want to sit and wait.
Yeah.
And there's sometimes you got to get up and go.
Well, to reference the special episode that we had, I think Matt did a really good job of saying, you can be confident in what God called you to, just don't be super confident in how it's going to work out specifically.
Yes.
And I think this is a great example of that. You were confident God was calling you to plant this church, but you weren't just going to sit around and wait for every single detail to be handed to you in a manila envelope.
No, I didn't expect ravens to fly overhead and drop pieces of bread.
Which, funny you say that, because, spoiler alert, knowing the story like I do, you never stepped foot in a classroom to teach because God affirmed this call in a very special way.
Absolutely. That I think is such a good point because I've often, at the time I thought, well, why did I go through all of this stuff if I wasn't going to do it anyway? I think that was all a part of the growth process and all a part of listening to God and depending on him. But God confirmed it in a powerful way, and I never did step into the class, and I never missed a meal.
Yeah, so feel free to be as generic as you want, but would you want to share, what that was, how that kind of unexpectedly came through from God's people affirming that call?
Yeah, I didn't know how much detail you wanted to go into that, but I'll try to do it fairly generically. I will say this. I think it all started...
Go as specific as you want to.
Okay. All right. So what happened basically is this. I had already secured a job teaching, and I knew that I had a job waiting on me. All I had to do was pass the test. I did pass the test. Of course, if you've gone through those, it takes a little while to get your scores back. I think they get them back quicker now, but at that time it took a while. So in the process of doing that, I'm preparing to go. I know I've got a job in hand, but there were some individuals in the meantime who really wanted to invest in this work. And so they pledged to give so much to the work, and that helped me, but it wasn't nearly enough to live on.
Yeah.
And so, but it was at least an encouragement,
Yeah.
Okay.
It can be an affirmation.
Yeah. Well, God is in this, and he's moving in people's lives. But the real clicker was I received my test scores on Friday, and this so much references last week. Again, I got my test scores on Friday. On Saturday, Beth and I sat down to talk, and I knew I had passed the test. I was going to call the principal on Monday to accept the job. On Saturday, Beth and I sat down for conversation, and we decided, and I should say she instigated this. Again, I think that's a very important lesson for us, that if we are in a marriage relationship, we need to talk with spouses through this thing. She shared with me, she said, I just don't sense that God wants us to take that job. And, of course, my response is, well, why, And she said, I've always said she's way more spiritual than me. She said, I think God wants us to learn to trust him. Well, how do you argue with that, Chip? I don't know, So long story short, we wrestled with that over the weekend. We actually called the principal on Monday, told him I passed the test scores, but I couldn't take the job. He's a Christian, so he understood, as much as you're going to understand. He had questions too. But the next week, I was sitting in church, and we would call him executive pastor today, but at that time he was our business pastor. He was our, I don't remember what his title was, but anyway, administrator, I think we called him. He got up to make announcements, and he said, hey, just want everybody to know that the church met Wednesday night, and we made a decision, and we're going to help support Pastor Eddie. And you don't mind if I tell a little bit more?
Yeah, not at all.
So what they did, to be very specific, is they said, we're going to allow him to stay on full salary and benefits throughout the next 2 months. And then for the next 3 months, we're going to give him 90% of his salary and all of his benefits. And for the next 3 months, we're going to do 80% of his salary and all his benefits. And we're going to allow him to live in our house until we call another pastor, which I knew would be another 6 to 8 months. So you talk about a moment. Yeah. That's huge. But there's something even bigger. Yeah. There's something even bigger. And this is where it gets maybe a little nuanced. I don't know. Something even bigger. The same morning, a Sunday school class came up to me. Okay. Now, Sunday school class, if you don't know what that is, that's like Sunday school as you would think. And this was probably like a third or fourth grade class. It might have been fourth and fifth. I don't remember the details. But a children's class came up to me. And they had a jar. And the jar was filled with coins, right? They came to me, and after the service, they presented that to me, and they said, Pastor Eddie, we want to support your new work, and we want to support your new church, is what they said, and we want to give this to you as an offering. That was the first official offering given to the orchard, right? And I looked at that, and I'm in tears at that time. These are precious children. I don't know how much was in there. It couldn't have been much over $10, but it was their hard-earned dollars.
Wasn't the point.
No, it was their pennies, nickels, and dimes. And in all honesty, Chip, every fall festival that we have, when we pass a budget and vote on a budget, and I hear the dollar amount of those budgets, particularly this last year, I think about those kids, and I think about their offering, and I think about a little boy who brought a couple of fish and some loaves of bread and how God multiplied it. And I'm so glad my wife said to me one day, I think God wants us to learn to trust him.
Yeah, I think, that's an incredible real life story for me, because the initial reaction was, this is what God said, so we believe he's going to do it. And even that, you had some excuses. You had
absolutely.
But once you were settled on that part of it, you didn't just sit around and say, okay, God, well, I want this, this, and this. Like, you went and got certified to teach. You had a job. You're ready to take it. then it was, well, let's just trust. Let's just trust. And I'm sure that knowing you and Miss Beth, if First Baptist Perry had never made that offer and 9 months in, you guys weren't able to pay bills, you weren't just going to say, well, God failed us. I can't believe he let us down. It would be, okay, we've had this period we learned to trust. Let's see what's next. Mm-hmm. But that's not how it worked out. No. God did step up. And, to me, and I hope you guys listening hear this, for Pastor Eddie, it was as much about the affirmation of the call than it was about his budget being funded so that he could pay mortgage and electric bills, Yeah,
absolutely, because that 6 months was going to run out, right? And so, it was much more than that. It was the affirmation of the call. Because as we talked last week, if I knew God was there, if I knew he was calling me, then I felt like, okay, I can deal with whatever comes, right? But as we said last week, whether or not that total affirmation, 100% affirmation was there was enough affirmation there that I knew, I just knew that God wanted us to take this step. I just didn't know how it was going to look.
Yeah, it's, one of the things that I love about the Orchard, and I don't know it's still true today, 18 years going, but there was a long time that all of us who came on staff at the Orchard had to take some kind of pay cut to come. Not like you and Miss Beth, who had to take 100% pay cut to come, but just that, hey, if you really believe this is where God's calling you, then step out and trust and see what happens. And to me, it's important that if you're listening to this, you don't just hear that as pastor talk. Like, this wasn't Pastor Eddie and First Lady, make sure she hears that, First Lady, Miss Beth, who took that step of faith. It was husband and father and grandfather Eddie, who had to take that step. And am I going to be able to buy a Christmas present for my new grandchild, which I'll never forget. I was at the service where you guys shared about cash, and my favorite was, I've always wanted a little cash around.
But talking about my family and talking about what you just said, bro, I mentioned this in Live Oak yesterday because I used a little bit of this in Live Oak yesterday at Matt's suggestion, actually. And so I happen to think this was so unusual that when I called my son, now my son was grown and had his own family at that time. When I called, and then my daughter had similar response when I talked to her, when I told them what we were thinking about doing, because up to then we didn't ease into it with them. We pretty much said, this is what we're going to do. I'll never forget what he said. And just remember, parents, everything comes back to you. You tell your children. Because his first comment was, Dad, have you really thought this through?
Well, and if you know Eddie's children, John and Casey, it makes it even funnier.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's been good. I think it's been a good conversation maybe to round out our series and to bring it home. So I hope it's been helpful to you. Not just that you learn a little bit more of the history of the Orchard, if this is where you call home, but just a real life example of how it's easy to make excuses, that it takes faith to overcome them. It's not that you never have doubts, but you just have to have that faith bigger than your doubt. You got to have trust bigger than your excuses. So, Eddie, thanks for stepping in today.
Yeah, thank you, Chip. My pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
It's been good. So we'll leave it with you this week. I hope that you'll join us back again next week as we dig into a brand new sermon series starting through the book of Jonah. All right, we'll see you then.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Let's Talk About That. We hope it encouraged and challenged you as we continue to grow in this journey of faith and embrace community. If you have more questions, thoughts, or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us through our social media channels or visit our website and stay connected. Your questions are what make this podcast a dynamic and enriching experience. If you found today's discussion meaningful, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Your engagement helps us spread the message and connect with others who may find value in these conversations. Until next time, we hope this episode inspired you and will help you bring Sunday's message into your week ahead. Keep the conversation alive, and remember, we're all on this journey together.